So today I'm lucky enough to be in Bavaria and specifically in Berchtesgadener land. Now, for those that don't know, Berchtesgaden and the Obersalzberg, which overlooks it, became the seat of power for the Nazi Party, not only in this region, but throughout the whole of the Third Reich. And as you can see, it's a stunning area, but it has a real dark heart and a real dark past. What we're going to do today, we're going to go and visit some of the well-known locations here, such as the Kehlsteinhaus, the Berghof, and some of the ones that are less well visited, such as the tea house on the Moos-Lannekopf, Göring's old residence, Bormann, and that of Albert Speer, and as well as some of the other less prominent buildings that are still present on the Obersalzberg today. So now I am stood in what is without question the very heart of darkness of the Obersalzberg. This is the site of the Berghof, and this was Adolf Hitler's residency during his stays here at the Obersalzberg. So originally the Berghof wasn't the Berghof, it didn't start out life that way. In 1916 a house was built here, and it was known as Haus Wachenfeld, and it was built as a holiday cottage by a gentleman for his wife, where they could come and enjoy the stunning views of the Untersberg. With the Nazi takeover here in the Obersalzberg region, Hitler initially rented the house through his half-sister in 1927, and he liked it so much that when the party ascended to power, the property was bought by the government and work quickly began to convert it into the Berghof. So in 1933, after Hitler had ascended to power, the building that would become the Berghof started to go through numerous iterations. It was enlarged, additional buildings were added, and then by 1936 the Berghof, as it was known throughout Hitler's reign, was completed. The building itself was without doubt extremely impressive. Most notably, there was a huge square window that overlooked the Untersberg mountain, which is just to my left there, and the view must have been incredible. Now, the remains of the Berghof today are almost non-existent. The southern retaining walls are still in place. However, during the 25th of April 1945 raid, the Berghof itself was hit quite heavily by the Royal Air Force and bombers from the United States Army Air Force. They, I think, blew off the roof, hit some of the other buildings further down the driveway, and then the fire that started it gutted the building. The building remained in place for a further 7 years. Then, in conjunction with the Bavarian and the US Army government that was in place at the time, the building was finally demolished because of its connections with Hitler and the regime, and clearly the government at the time wanted to get rid of those connections by removing all visible traces of the previous occupants here. So now I am at one fairly significant place on the Obersalzberg. This is the Hotel Zum Türken. Before the Nazis moved into this area, this property was owned by Karl Schuster, and when the Nazis kind of started to take this place over, he found that it was bad for his business due to all the control measures that were put in place. So he was sadly forced to sell up. After he did so, this building became the headquarters for Hitler's personal guard. Then later on in its lifetime, during the Nazi regime being in this area, Martin Bormann assigned it as the headquarters for the Reichssicherheitsdienst, the RSD, basically the intelligence services that were solely responsible for Hitler's safety and well-being here on the Obersalzberg. Now, during the April 25th bombing in 1945, when the RAF and the United States Army Air Force bombed the whole of the Obersalzberg, the Zum Türken was hit, and it was in the end had to be torn down, but subsequently rebuilt in exactly the same style. Interestingly though, with the property, there's still a lot of the original features that do remain that can be seen in period photos, such as the former guard post right there, and there would always be a member of the Waffen SS from the 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler would be on guard there, because down there behind me is the way to the Berghof, Hitler's private residence here on the Obersalzberg, and up the road behind me there was Göring's property and that of Reichsleiter Martin Bormann. So up until recently, the Zum Türken was, as its original purpose, still a hotel. However, I believe it was sold in either 2020 or 2021, and at the moment its future is uncertain. This is a shame, because here at the Zum Türken, just behind me where those garages are, there were access to the tunnel network that runs all underneath the Obersalzberg, and these tunnels were used as air raid shelters, as storage facilities and defensive positions, had indeed the Obersalzberg become Hitler's final stand. Obviously they were never used as such, they were used as air raid shelters however, but since its closure and sale, they haven't been reopened, which is a real shame, because I understand from people that have visited there, they're fascinating to explore. As for the hotel, hopefully the new owners will reopen it and continue its life as a hotel, so that this piece of history isn't torn down and repurposed for something else. Yes, it has a very dark past, but we need to preserve this so that future generations can come here and understand what this area meant, what this place was, and understand the context of it. And we can only do that through keeping these original buildings where they belong, in the condition that they belong in. So after the failed putsch in early November 1923, Adolf Hitler was sent to Landsberg prison, which is just to the west of Munich. He didn't serve in prison very long there, and he was released. And when he was released, he came here as a bit of a retreat to Berchtesgaden, to the Obersalzberg. And the ruins here behind me was the cottage that he stayed in during this time, and it was here right behind me where he wrote the second half of his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. So it was literally right here where his delusions and his crazy ideas that would impact the world so greatly over the next 20 years up until his death, that were written right in this spot here. It's now known as during his stay here, it became a little bit of a shrine to party followers and got the name of Kampfhäusel. That's what it's known as today. You can see it on Google Earth, it comes up, but these are the only foundations that are left of that building. Yeah, quite eerie to be stood in this location, knowing the deluded thoughts that went on here and that went into his book, that would then impact countless millions over the next 20 years. So the Kehlsteinhaus, or House on the Mountain, was a 50th birthday present from Reichsleiter Martin Bormann to Hitler. It was finished in 1938 and sits approximately 6,100 feet above sea level on top of the mountain here. Calling it the tea house is somewhat of a misnomer. It was never known as that, and the name the Eagle's Nest was not a phrase used by the Germans. This was later coined by a British journalist and then made more popular by a follow-up French journalist in 1938. And then clearly, since its capture in early May 1945 by the 101st Airborne, the name has stuck since. But still, in the local area, you will see the signs up as Kehlsteinhaus. There's no mention of the Eagle's Nest per se. Now it's extremely popular with tourists. As you can see, there's multiple buses that turn up here every few minutes and drop people off at the tunnel below, and then you ride 400 feet up in Hitler's gold-plated elevator up to the Kehlsteinhaus itself. So, early May 1945, May the 4th and 5th, you've got elements of the US 3rd Infantry Division capturing and securing Berchtesgaden in the valley below. And here at the Obersalzberg, men of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment were climbing the mountain here to take and secure the Eagle's Nest, and this really was seen as the jewel in the crown of liberating Hitler's Europe, of capturing all things tied directly to Hitler and the Nazi Party in this region. So now I'm walking back up to the Kehlsteinhaus and take a walk around the inside of it. if you're going to visit the Eagle's Nest, my recommendation would be get here early in the morning. The first bus is at 08:30 in the morning, and it's well worth getting here for that, because the car park down below by the documentation centre gets very, very full, very, very quick, and extremely busy, full of tourists. So if you're going to visit here, highly recommend you get the first bus up. It means you get to enjoy the area in relatively unspoiled settings, and then the good thing is there's a restaurant here, so you can get a beer and a bite to eat and enjoy the spectacular view. So, I am at one of the sites that was often frequented by Hitler. This was the location of his tea house, built in 1937 on the Moos Kopf, which is this outcrop of land here on the Obersalzberg. And in the valley behind me, you can see Salzburg Castle all the way in the distance, and the views are truly stunning. Now, this was the location that he would come to most afternoons when he was in residence at the Berghof, and he would go to the tea house, which is no longer there, unfortunately, but it was present up in that area just behind me. I say he would come here most afternoons and enjoy talks with his closest confidants, with allies, and with high-ranking Nazi officials, and here he would play out his warped ideas. This was the one, though, this was the place that he visited most often. The Kehlsteinhaus, although very impressive from our perspective, with his fear of heights, he didn't like going up there too often. He would only really go there to show dignitaries around, and to impress them with the grandeur of the view and the achievement of building the Kehlsteinhaus there in the first place. But this was the location where he liked to come and relax and really take in the unmistakable magnificence of the Obersalzberg and the surrounding region itself. The tea house itself was knocked down in the early 1950s due to its clear association with Hitler, and then the ruins in 2006 were finally taken away. I don't personally see the point in removing the ruins. People come to this spot anyway, same with the Berghof. People go to these locations because of their historical significance, and yes, unfortunately, I'm sure these locations do attract the wrong sorts of individuals, but they also attract a lot more people who like the hiking and the view, but also have a genuine interest in trying to understand this region, understand what happened here, and the complexities of the personalities that were involved during the Nazi regime and everything that went with it. I personally would have preferred to have seen the ruins there. I think the ruins speak for themselves, but bulldozing them away and just removing them, I think, sends the message that the past is trying to be hidden. Now, that's my personal view, and I think we should face history, warts and all, especially the really uncomfortable bits, because that's the only way we can question ourselves as a race and understand where we went wrong and what we must do to avoid going wrong again in the future. But that's my point. That's my personal point of view on this area. I do think the view is absolutely stunning. It's, you know, it's very Bavarian, and on a day like this when the weather's good, it's fantastic. You know, seeing all the way into Austria, into Salzburg is fantastic. But clearly this patch of land here is associated with some of humanity's darkest times, and that must not be forgotten. Behind me there, in that flat open ground where those buildings and those rubble heaps are, that's the site of the former SS barracks that were here on the Obersalzberg. Obviously, with the Nazi hierarchy being here, there was at least a perceived need anyway to have bigger garrisons here. So the barracks was built here, and they housed not only Hitler's personal bodyguard from the 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, but also they were here to generally protect the Obersalzberg itself and act as the garrison for the whole area. But now it's part of the hotel, and yeah, it's completely transformed from what it looked like during the war years. So the location I'm at now, right here, this was Reich Marshal Göring's property. Sadly, now there is literally zero trace of it left. The former site where any kind of trace was left was torn down in the late 90s, early 2000s to make way for a massive new hotel, which is right there. Very nice looking hotel, by the way. But the site of his former property is now a duck pond. But the house itself that Göring occupied during his residency here was one of those properties that was still, it was always going to be taken by the Nazi party, but it was done in one of the most or least forceful ways from the original owners, and it was gifted to Göring in 1933. It was a small mountain lodge, and when I say small, it's small by Bavarian standards, which by everywhere else means it's a really big house, or was a really big house. In 1941 he had it enlarged, it almost doubled in size, and a big swimming pool was put in, and allegedly in the late 90s, early 2000s, you could still find traces of the tiles from the swimming pool in the grounds here, but they're all gone now. His house itself, during the April bombing raid on the 25th of April 45, it was hit. One end was all but destroyed, and then soon after the war it was pulled down, and just the foundations existed until the early 2000s. Interestingly, considering how a lot of the buildings were torn down, certainly of all the prominent Nazis that were here, one that remains, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit, was Göring's adjutant, and it's just down there, just at the bottom of this hill, and that was General Karl Bodenschatz and his family that were billeted here. They had a property here, and then further down the Hinterreck, which is the road that runs up from the Zum Türken past the Berghof, past this hotel here, and all the way through into the next valley. That's got further quarters for his adjutant staff that were present here during the war, and those properties remain to this day. Right, so as I alluded to a moment ago, I said that there was no remains of Göring's house, which there isn't. That is factually correct. However, there are just some very small traces of his property left. So the physical structure of the house, clearly nothing to be seen now. But these steps right here, these formed part of his property, and it's quite ironic, I think, that of the so-called 1,000-year Reich, all that's left is some crumbling old steps, which I think is a really fitting tribute. So yeah, that's it. These are just quietly hidden away in the back of the woods, and time and nature are taking their toll and removing them. So the house behind me there, that's an original wartime building. As I alluded to when I was stood at Göring's old place, that was his adjutant's residency belonging to General Karl Bodenschatz. That was where he lived. He was quartered there with his family, and it meant that he was in very close proximity to the Reichsmarshal whenever he was needed during Göring's stay here at the Obersalzberg. So just behind me there's 3 houses with green roofs. Those were SS officers' quarters for them and their families during their time here on the Obersalzberg. They were quartered there, and it meant they were in close proximity. They could be called upon at any time to carry out administrative functions for the Obersalzberg area, obviously in connection as well with the SS garrison that was here. So Bormann took over a house that was previously owned by a gentleman called Seitz, and the property was ideally sited because it meant that he had commanding views of the Obersalzberg itself, but specifically he could see Hitler's residence at the Berghof, and he could see the wider comings and goings. And Bormann was the Nazi who was responsible for the administration of the overall running of the Obersalzberg itself. So this house was ideal for him. Now, the house initially was quite modest, but in true Nazi fashion, it was enlarged and lavishly furnished. But rather justly, on the 25th of April 1945, his house received, I don't know whether it was a direct hit or whether it was an extremely close hit, but the house was largely destroyed, and now nothing remains of it. So I've come just a little bit further around the Obersalzberg now, just probably half a mile from the Berghof area itself and the documentation centre, to find one of the still standing original buildings from the 1940s. And behind me is the coal bunker. Now, admittedly, yeah, coal storage, not that interesting, but this one itself was built in 1940 and could hold 3,500 tons of coal. Trucks would, as the Hinterrecht, the road which is at the top here, trucks would come in, drop it, it would then filter down into these cellars here, when then smaller trucks could then take the coal, take it away and take it to the buildings that it needed to be used. And of interest, when the SS retreated from this area in May 1945, they set the coal on fire, they set the bunker on fire, and it burnt here until October 1945. It's now derelict, it's not used for anything, it's abandoned, it's too big to break apart and take down. It just sits here silently in the woods as a relic to a former era here of the regime. But it is impressive. It's very easy to find. You can find it on Google Maps, and it's just a straight path down from the road to walk down here. So, hope you enjoy it. You say it's coal bunker. It's not that interesting, but it is from that era. It did serve a purpose here in the context of the Nazi regime that took up residency here. So, it's definitely relevant.